Hello and welcome back to another episode of Street Smarts. Today, I want to talk a little bit about adding dynamism to your photos, and this is the first time that we're actually going to be doing something that contradicts an earlier Street Smarts, but I think it makes sense because these are all different tools that you're going to learn to use, and you might not always need to use each one in conjunction. So in the past, I've said for shutter speed that you should be using 1/500th of a second if you're going to be hip shooting, because it will increase your hit rate. It's more likely to freeze whatever motion you might have from your body movement, but also from the movement in the scene. But today, we're going to talk about a bunch of different things you can do with slower shutter speeds to increase dynamism and add another layer of motion and action to your photos. Okay, so for the first thing we're going to try is you're going to be using slow shutter speed to get a little bit of motion blur in your photos. So you're going to be standing still and you're going to try and hold your camera still because we're going to be using a slower shutter speed. So let's say you're taking a photo of a person. This is going to be somewhere in like 160 or 130 because it's generally believed that you can freeze people's motion, walking motion at least, with like 1/100th to 1/125th of a second. So 1/60th should give you a little bit of blur, 1/30th will give you a little bit more blur, and the slower you can go, the more blur you'll get. So if you did like a really long exposure, you'd get a lot more blur, but you'd probably get just whole swaths of movement instead of like discernible people. So this sort of thing really only works at a semi-slow shutter speed, but this is relative to the thing that you're capturing. So if you're trying to capture, say, a car, 1/125th might be fine if it's going decently fast. If it's just going like 30-40 miles per hour, you can probably pretty well get motion blur already, because with a car you're probably going to want to freeze it at a much faster shutter speed anyway. So for people, I'd say start at 1/60th and then sort of work your way down. So I'm gonna put up some photos now so you can see what I mean about the slight motion blur, and we'll do one at 1/60th so you can see what that looks like. We'll do one at 1/30th so you can see what that looks like, and then maybe a few even slower than that. So that's number one. You stay still and you just use a slower shutter speed. Now with that one, the only issue is that you're getting that motion blur, so your subject might be blurred. Now, this can be useful if you're trying to convey some sort of movement or motion or action that they're doing. But if you want your subject to be sharp, but there to be like motion blur elsewhere so that you can divert more attention to the subject, you can achieve that too. And to do that, again, I would suggest something around 1/30th, maybe a little bit here or there, depending on how comfortable you are hand holding and how you want this to turn out. But you're just going to track your subject with your camera. So if someone's walking, say, from over there to over here, I would go like this to track with them. So I'm gonna set my shutter speed like this, and then I just keep them in the center of the frame or wherever the focus point is, and then I take the photo while tracking them. And that's basically how that's going to work. And I like to do this a lot. I do this specifically when I see someone on a bike or someone in a car that's going through somewhere that I can just sort of track it. In 1/30th will work for a car too, especially if you're tracking it. But it'll work for a car that's going sort of slower. If it's just going through like an intersection or something like that, it's not going to be going super fast. It'll work. So that's a really good one. And that's my personal favorite one. I use this one a lot. And there is a variation of this technique, which is very common with wedding and event and even concert photographers, which is to use shutter drag with flash. So you use your flash to illuminate your subject and use a slow shutter speed. So when the flash hits, after the flash has subsided, you just drag a little bit the camera. So you get motion blur of the surroundings, but the main subject, who was only illuminated by the flash, isn't affected by anything else. This really only works when you have other surrounding lights and things that would be persistent in the frame, and the flash would only illuminate your subject. So that's a really cool one you can check out. I'll put some examples of that up here. And now we're going to move on to talk about another type of adding a little bit of dynamism, which actually doesn't involve changing any of your settings, but changing your perspective just a little bit. Okay, so using perspective to add dynamism is an interesting thing that you can do, which might sound a little bit silly because it might go against something you may have learned to begin with, which is about keeping the horizon level. So I'm going to talk about just tilting your camera. You may have heard the term Dutch angle, and it's funny because when I started shooting, I also thought that I always wanted the horizon to be level. I wanted perspectives to be prim and proper. But since then, I've come to realize that that's just a very rigid way of making these photos. And I think that it's a lot nicer to have a little bit more, playfulness and not box yourself in. Now, you can add a little bit more chaos and a little bit more energy to your photos by just making sure that it's not always in order, because the world is not always in order, right? So, when I say angles, you could be angling it like this, you could be angling it like this, you could be angling it sort of even lateral. It's just sometimes it's useful to try and get the right things in your frame, but also sometimes if you have, say, like someone running through a frame, if you angled it in a certain way, it would look like they're either running out of the frame, or it would look like they're sort of falling down from a frame. And these are just a few small tools that you can use in the way we photograph, because at the end of the day, with photography, we're capturing the real world, but we also get a lot of creative tools, and we have a lot of artistic interpretation that we can do. So it's nice to know and practice these things. So I'll give you some examples here. But I also find that when I'm hip shooting, that naturally the camera isn't always level, and many times I find that this looks, the photos that come out of this, even with a slight skew sometimes, they just feel better than they do, because you can always fix the perspective after the fact in Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever sort of editing software you're using. And many times I do try it and just see what it would look like if it was upright correctly. But I just find that I prefer this natural look. It shows the world the way it was captured by me in the first place. And I like it, I do still keep a level on in my camera, so that most of the time when I want things to be level, I can have them level. But generally, if I'm not too bothered, I'll just take the shot the way I think works best. And the last one, which we're not going to get too much into because I think it could be its own separate street smarts somewhere down the line. So we're going to stick to the most basic level, but the main concept is layering, which is sort of like the Mac Daddy of street photography concepts and documentary concepts. And that's just trying to thread many different scenes into one scene, and many different narratives into one scene by having lots of different subjects and lots of different layers in an image. But we're going to talk about the most basic use case, which is blocking, which just means you will be using the foreground or the background and just different elements in the scene to divert attention towards a subject. And so you can also add depth to your image by doing that. So if you're shooting quite a deep depth of field, but even a shallow depth of field, you can sort of block parts of your scene using foreground objects, or using the subject as even a block and then having a long throw into a background. This creates depth. Even though our photo is always 2D, this gives it a more of a 3D real feeling. I'll throw some examples up of some great images. I think Faizal Westcotts has a great video about blocking, so you can go watch that too. But we're just gonna go over just a little basic, and I'll show some pictures that I specifically took with this concept in mind, but just more of other people's work too, so you can see. But just in general, it's a very great concept to have because it allows you to use that frame better. It allows you to think about composition and how you can attract the viewer's eye to one spot, but also add something to the image that doesn't take away from the subject, but also gives it more of a depth. Yeah, I don't know, I've said depth too many times now, but you know what I mean. All right, So that's it from me. Thank you for watching this episode of Street Smarts. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know if you've noticed, this is different. I have moved, but you know, that's not going to change very much. It is some of the reason why I haven't been posting in a while. I've had a lot of videos that are sort of in the works and they're very close to being done, but you might see some intro outro mismatches because some of it was filmed in my previous place and some of them will be filmed here. But you know, it is what it is. It's a great time. There's a lot of really cool things that I've been trying to do and trying out recently that I think will make it to the channel very soon. So stay tuned for that. I hope to see you in the next one. And you know, let me know if you have any questions. I'm always happy to chat in the comments or in my DMs. And if you have any suggestions for something you'd like to see on Street Smarts or anywhere else, you know, I can make another rant video, whatever, just let me know. But thank you. Bye.